Endocrine system 2, we're going to talk about the anatomy of each gland, including their location. We'll talk about the hormones secreted by each gland. We'll talk about the target tissues, an example of target tissue response to each hormone, the mechanisms that regulate hormone secretion by specific glands with the examples given. Well, for selected hormones, we'll talk about the causes and consequences of either hyper or hyposecretion, and then diseases of interest that result from that hyper or hyposecretion of hormones, so too much or too little. We'll talk about those with very specific glands along the way. All right, so in your lecture notes, there's this drawing here. It's the best I could do, so don't make fun of me. It looked way worse a couple semesters ago. But this is the pituitary gland. It has two lobes to it, an anterior and posterior lobe. And then this is the hypothalamus here. And so we're going to talk about the pathways for sending hormones along these structures. So let me see. Yeah, so first of all, the hypothalamus. What tissue, kind of tissue, the four main tissue types, what kind of tissue is this made from? Nervous tissue. So this is nervous tissue. And then we have a posterior pituitary and an anterior pituitary. From Monday and from B32, what is the tissue type that we find in glands? Supracuboidal specifically, yes, but epithelium is the main tissue type. So that's what we're going to find in the anterior pituitary is epithelial tissue. And then the posterior pituitary actually is not an actual secreting gland. It's actually also made from nervous tissue. And so we'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. But for now, hypothalamus is nervous tissue. The anterior pituitary is epithelial tissue. It is a gland. We'll talk about the hormones that it secretes. And then posterior is actually nervous tissue. All right, so how hormone secretion works through the anterior pituitary is the anterior pituitary is controlled by signals that come from the hypothalamus. So here are some neurons that are extending, not quite into the anterior pituitary yet, but it's extending into a set of capillaries or a capillary bed, kind of in between that junction between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Those neurons, because they come from the hypothalamus, we call those hypothalamic neurons. Okay? So one thing to know is that there is no direct neural connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. It's going to connect to each other and communicate to each other through a series of capillary beds and blood vessels. So how it works is essentially the hypothalamus is going to release its own release its own hormones, and we'll talk about what they're called here in a second. But the hypothalamus releases its own hormones. That's actually going to be sent down these sets of capillary beds here. And those hormones are actually going to bind to epithelial cells in the anterior pituitary. And once that hormone binds to its receptor at the anterior pituitary, then those cells are actually going to secrete their own hormones that are going to circulate throughout the body. So we talked about on Monday different types of stimuli. How do we get endocrine glands to release the hormones that they're supposed to secrete? It could either be humoral, where there's a change in circulating blood levels of some kind of substance or solute that either increases or decreases below its set point. So like I said, if your blood sugar raises too high, insulin is going to get sent out in order to bring it back down. If your blood sugar is too low, something called glucagon is going to be sent out in order to bring those levels back up. If calcium is too low, parathyroid hormone gets sent out, and so on and so forth. That would be humoral stimuli. Okay. There's also neurostimuli where some kind of electrical signal is being sent to cause the release of hormones, like oxytocin with childbirth. Okay. This case here is a hormone from the hypothalamus telling another hormone to be released from an endocrine gland. So what kind of stimulus would that be? Hormonal. Okay, it's one hormone controlling the release of another hormone. Okay, Okay, so this would be a hormonal stimulus. So let's take a step back so we can kind of talk through these steps here. So the hypothalamic neurons in the hypothalamus release their own set of hormones. Okay, we actually call these something different. They're not your typical hormone because hormones are usually secreted by glands that are made up of epithelial tissue. This is a hormone coming from nervous tissue. Okay, but it's not, what do we usually call chemical messengers that are being sent by neurons?
Ligands.
So ligands is a general term, but specifically for the nervous system, what do we call those chemical messengers? Neurotransmitters, right? Neurotransmitters are what are being sent between neuron to neuron or neuron to muscle. This is a hormone made by a neuron, okay, that's actually going into the blood. So it's not in a synapse like you would normally see in the nervous system. So we call these a different name. Neurohormones. So the hypothalamus releases neurohormones. Okay, they are not considered neurotransmitters because they travel by the blood like hormones do. Everybody okay with that term? Okay. So the neurohormones actually move through this system. It's called a capillary portal system. And I think it's mentioned in your lecture notes. So again, there's no direct connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. We use this capillary portal system to allow that communication from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. So this first capillary bed is called the primary capillary plexus. And the second set over here, this other capillary bed, is the secondary capillary plexus. Now, I won't test you on the anatomy of this portal system. Just know that we have a first capillary bed that these neurohormones get sent into. They're going to travel down these blood vessels to a second capillary bed. Okay. And so these blue circles here represent epithelial cells found in the anterior pituitary. Those are the cells that are going to be responsible for releasing their own hormones when this neurohormone binds. So each one of these epithelial cells will have a receptor for these neurohormones to go ahead and bind to. Once these neurohormones bind to these epithelial cells in the anterior pituitary, then those cells are then triggered to release their own hormones, which are in green. So the hypothalamus is regulating the release of hormones through the anterior pituitary. Anybody have any questions on that concept? Yeah.
So there are no receptors when the neurons are released in that blood vessel where primary capillary.
Don't do that. I'll keep them so we can see them. Are you talking about in this capillary bed here? The first one? Yeah. Let me draw it on it. He's talking about this capillary bed here. So, no, there's not going to be any receptors there. This is kind of just their drop-off point. And then they travel down blood vessels to actually get to the anterior pituitary. Because that primary capillary plexus is not quite in the anterior pituitary yet. So we're not going to find epithelial cells just yet. They have to travel down this portal system. And then the cells at the end will have the receptors for it.
And so after the neurotransmitter is released,
Neurohormones,
is there a reuptake of any kind, like
No, these are neurohormones. They should all be released into the bloodstream. Now they're gone. They're away from that neuron. Any other questions about how this works? Quick Bio 32 review. Does anybody remember what skeletal structure the pituitary gland sits in. Sella turcica, yay! Music to my ears. So yeah, so the sella turcica. Anybody remember which
Sphenoid bone?
sphenoid bone? Yeah, I had to make sure I remembered in my own head before I asked it, but yes, it's part of the sphenoid bone. All right, I think we're good there. All right, so there are actually 6 different neurohormones that target 6 different populations in the anterior pituitary gland. So, because remember we said every hormone has a very specific receptor. So these 6 neurohormones that get released by the hypothalamus are going to have 6 different receptors to bind to in the anterior pituitary. Most of these hormones that come from the hypothalamus, neurohormones, are either releasing or inhibitory. So they're either going to cause the release of the subsequent hormone, or they're going to inhibit it. And so we're actually only going to focus on 2 of those 6, so you don't have to worry about all 6, just 2 of them. We're going to talk about growth hormone releasing hormone. This is a neurohormone from the hypothalamus. It causes the release of growth hormone. And then thyroid releasing hormone. Thyroid releasing hormone doesn't cause the release of thyroid hormone. It actually causes the release of something called thyroid stimulating hormone, and then that causes the release of thyroid hormone. So we'll talk about that as well. Any questions about that? Okay. I want to make sure I'm not skipping anything in the lecture notes either. All right. And then the hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary, because these 2 are from the hypothalamus, the releasing hormones are from the hypothalamus. And then the hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary include growth hormone. It's triggered by that growth hormone releasing hormone, also known as GHRH. Remember, hormones can be abbreviated, so you can use the abbreviations if you need to. But growth hormone is triggered by GHRH, and it's secreted by epithelial cells with a GHRH receptor. So what that means is the hypothalamus releases GHRH that travels down that portal system that we talked about, and then it binds to cells with the receptor for that GHRH. Once the GHRH binds to those epithelial cells in the anterior pituitary, then those cells can then release growth hormone. So I'm going to show you how that works. So this is the hypothalamus. It's releasing, let's say this is GHRH. That is going to travel down this portal system until it gets to a set of cells with a receptor for GHRH. Once that hormone binds, once the GHRH binds to the epithelial cells, then those epithelial cells can then release growth hormone. Does that concept make sense to everyone? Anybody have any questions about how that pathway works? Okay, we're going to give another example of it as well.
So the
Go ahead.
hypothalamus releases or binds to the receptor and releases GHRH, and then it triggers.
So we don't really talk about what happens before the hypothalamus releases a GHRH. There's some signal from the body to tell it to release this GHRH hormone, neurohormone. The hypothalamus then releases the GHRH. It travels to this portal system until it finds a receptor to bind to in the anterior pituitary, and then those cells then can release growth hormone. The next one is thyroid stimulating hormone. This comes from the anterior pituitary when it's triggered by thyroid releasing hormone. So thyroid releasing hormone comes from the hypothalamus. It's going to travel down that same portal system until it finds cells with a receptor for the thyroid releasing hormone, and then those cells can then release thyroid stimulating hormone. Once thyroid stimulating hormone is released, that actually goes and targets the thyroid gland specifically and has the thyroid gland then release thyroid hormone. So it's a whole long sequence. So what kind of stimulus causes release from the thyroid gland? We already talked about this. This will be the hormonal. It's a hormone telling another hormone to be released. So it's a hormonal stimulus. So I did it different colors, but it's the same drawing. So this is our thyroid releasing hormone, or TRH, coming from the hypothalamus. That is going to travel down the portal system until it reaches a set of cells that have a receptor for that TRH. Once that TRH binds, then those purple cells down there can then send their own hormone, which is that now this is called TSH. This is thyroid stimulating hormone. Or TSH. So any questions about how that process works? Yeah.
Professor, so at least in this situation, would TRH be considered the neurohormone?
Mm-hmm.
How about the thyroid stimulating hormone?
That's just a hormone, because the antipituitary is a true endocrine gland. It's made from that simple cuboidal epithelium, and it works just like any other endocrine gland. So those would be the hormone.
Okay, so
From the TRH is coming from the hypothalamus. It's called a neurohormone because it's essentially coming from the brain. It's coming from neurons. Neurons are making those, so we call them neurohormones. These at the bottom, the thyroid stimulating hormone, that's being made by epithelial cells. So that's a true hormone. We just call it a hormone.
so only whenever they're in the primary capillary plexus, they're going to be like a neurohormone?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So only those released by the hypothalamus and dropped off at that primary capillary plexus are considered neurohormones. Any other questions on this stuff? Okay. We also have what's called adrenocorticotropic hormone. I briefly mentioned it on Monday. It also is released by the anterior pituitary. It then targets the cortex of the adrenal gland to then release cortisol, which is our stress hormone. We also have follicle stimulating hormone, which we'll talk a lot about when we get to the reproductive system. Luteinizing hormone, which we will also talk about in the reproductive system. And then prolactin. But I do want to explain a couple of things here first, just so you know the basic functions of these hormones. So make sure you know ACTH triggers the release of cortisol. Follicle stimulating hormone, at least in women, it's for follicle growth. So follicles are where your oocytes or where the egg lives. So follicle growth. And then for males, it's for sperm production. Luteinizing hormone for females is for ovulation. It will also have a hand in sperm production in males too. And then prolactin is for breast milk production. And make sure you underline or highlight production, because we do have another hormone that's for the release of breast milk. Prolactin is specifically for the production of the breast milk. So production, not release. We'll have a different hormone that controls the release of breast milk. So for the four at the bottom, know their general function, what they're useful for. Prolactin is the only one we'll actually talk about the pathway for. The other three, you don't have to know in great detail. Just, again, know their basic functions. We're going to talk in more detail about growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and prolactin. The other ones, ACTH, we really don't talk much about at all. And then FSH and LH we'll talk about a lot at the end of the semester. So any questions about how the anterior pituitary gland works? Okay. So next we're going to talk about how the posterior pituitary works. So we still have these hypothalamic neurons from the hypothalamus, but now instead of going into a portal system like we saw with the anterior, these hypothalamic neurons are actually extending all the way down into the posterior pituitary gland. And you'll notice that this capillary bed that it secretes it into actually goes directly out of the brain and to the rest of the body. And so these hypothalamic neurons secrete, these are still neurohormones, secrete neurohormones directly into the body's blood supply. So what kind of tissue did I tell you the posterior pituitary was made out of? Nervous tissue. Okay, so there is no epithelial tissues here. It does not follow the same pathway as the anterior pituitary. Essentially what is happening here is that the posterior pituitary really is just a place for storage and release of the neurohormones that the hypothalamus is making. So the posterior pituitary isn't doing any real secreting itself. It's not making anything. It's just releasing it. Okay, yeah.
So there's no receptors right there?
There's no receptors. The hypothalamic neurons are releasing that neurohormone directly into the capillary bed, which is going to then circulate throughout the body. Okay.
So hypothalamus determines if it's going to release those two neurohormones?
Yeah, so there's only two that are released here, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, and that all comes from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to control the release of those.
Does it use the same nerves as the anterior?
They're both hypothalamic neurons. Ones are just going to be shorter, the other ones will be longer to extend all the way down to the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary, and this is all in your notes, acts as a storage for neurohormones made by the hypothalamus. The axon terminals extend all the way into the posterior pituitary to then secrete those neurohormones. And so in this case, because for every hormone that we talk about today, you're going to have to know what the secreting organ is. So who is sending that hormone? What is the target organ or cell? Who's receiving it? And then what's the response? And so for hormones that are released here, the secreting organ is the hypothalamus / posterior pituitary. Because they work together for the release of those hormones. The hypothalamus makes them, the posterior pituitary releases them. So you can't really have one without the other. They are both working together to secrete that particular hormone. Or set of hormones, the two. So as I mentioned, there are two neurohormones released here. The first one is oxytocin. This one is the one that's for breast milk letdown or release. And let me see if we talk about it more later, so I can hold off on saying too much about it. I like to talk, so sometimes I talk and then I get ahead of myself and then I'm like, oh wait, I already said that. Yeah, we're gonna talk more about it. So oxytocin is for breast milk letdown. It's also going to be involved in uterine contractions for childbirth, as well as bonding that occurs between mother and child, and also partners post intercourse. So we'll talk about that more a little bit later in today's lecture. And then the other neurohormone released here is ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. So just a quick bit, because we're going to talk about this more later, just so you know what ADH is for in general. ADH, and I'll write it over here so I have more room. ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone. The word diuresis, which we'll talk about much later, is urine formation. So essentially what ADH is for, it's to slow down diuresis, slow down the production of urine. Essentially what we're doing with anti-diuretic hormone is instead of putting water into urine, we're actually going to reabsorb that and redirect it back to the blood. So if you have more water going towards the blood instead of on its way out, then you're going against that kind of diuresis. You're making less urine output because you're putting that water back into the blood. And we'll talk more about how that works and why we do that a little bit later. So questions about how the anterior pituitary works versus the posterior pituitary, how the release is controlled. Yeah.
So it depends where the oxytocin is released. It can have different effects.
Mhm.
Traditional breast milk.
Yeah. So like I said, it does, the bonding portion is less understood as far as like how that mechanism works, but at least for breast milk letdown, that oxytocin would target the mammary glands to allow for the release of the breast milk, and then the oxytocin would then also target the uterus to cause contractions, because this is circulating throughout the entire body, so it's just looking for its receptors, right? And it'll find it at the breast and at the uterus.
So can you have production of letdown of breast milk and urate contraction at the same time?
You sure can. Yeah.
So the anterior is like the 6 hormones, how those release, and then the posterior is the 2.
Just those two. Yeah.
And it just releases the same way, like it releases, it goes down until it finds a receptor, and then it triggers the hormone to.
That's what happens in the anterior pituitary.
Okay.
In the posterior, there's no receptors at all.
Okay.
It's completely different because this is made from nervous tissue and it's not a true gland made of epithelial tissue. All that's happening is the hypothalamus is dropping off those neurohormones here in the posterior, and then it gets sent out to the rest of the body.
Okay.
Just no receptors, nothing. Just the hypothalamus makes this hormone, and then it gets released through the posterior pituitary.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So oxytocin is a neurohormone
Mm-hmm.
that circulates into the whole body.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. But because it ultimately came from the hypothalamus, it's still a neurohormone because it came from nervous tissue and not from an epithelial gland. Any other questions? Yeah.
Neurohormones can be like normal hormones, but not the other way around, right?
Yeah, so neurohormones act the same way as other hormones do. It's just we give them the name neurohormone because of where they come from, right? Endocrine glands are the ones that usually produce the hormones. That's a normal gland made from epithelial tissue like we would expect. But then we have these special set of other hormones that are made by the brain and by nervous tissue that normally it's not. So we give them a different name, a neurohormone, but they act the same way. They're just produced in a different location. Yeah, Corbin.
I know this is important, but the anterior pituitary versus the posterior, is there like a speed difference since the anterior has to go through the primary plexus and the secondary?
That would take a little bit longer because it would have to actually find the receptors, and those cells would then have to produce the other hormone, and then that has to get released. So it's going to be, I don't know the exact timing, but it would be a longer process than just the release directly out of the posterior pituitary. It's more steps. Yeah. Any other questions?
Are the two neurohormones that get stored in the posterior tube?
Yeah, until they're ready to be released. Yeah. Any other questions? She asked if they were stored in the posterior pituitary, these two neurohormones. And yeah, they're stored there until they're triggered to be released. Okay. All right, so overview of endocrine glands, where you can find them. You should have already either looked at the models on Monday, maybe watched my videos or looked at the textbook, but you should know the general idea of where all of these endocrine glands are. So the hypothalamus, although it's not a true endocrine gland, it is involved in this hormone process as we just talked about, so it's listed here. Well, the pineal gland is first up here. We're not going to talk about the pineal gland at all this semester. You learned about it in B32 with sleep schedules and stuff. At least it was briefly mentioned. We won't be talking about it in this class, but hypothalamus for sure, pituitary gland. The thyroid gland is kind of a bow tie or butterfly-shaped gland on the front of the throat and trachea. Parathyroid glands are on the back side of that. There are 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4 on each little part of the thyroid gland. But again, we don't have a model that shows that. The thymus gland, as I told you guys on Monday, it's right above the heart. We only find it on the infant model because it's largest the younger that you are. As you get older, that degenerates as your immune system develops and you need it less and less. Adrenal glands. They're called adrenal glands. Renal means kidney. Ad is outside, so they're the glands that are outside the kidneys, right? They're right on top. They're like little party hats that are right on top of the kidneys. They're like little triangles. Those are for cortisol release as well as our epinephrine, norepinephrine gets released from there as well. Not only the brain, it comes from the adrenal gland as well. And then a hormone called aldosterone. We'll talk about all of those a little bit later. The pancreas. It's important to know that the pancreas has a dual function. It's not only an endocrine gland, but it's also an exocrine gland too. So it produces digestive enzymes that get released into the digestive tract to break down food. And in that case, it would be considered a exocrine gland. Digestive enzymes and actually bicarbonate too. We'll talk about that much later. So not only does it produce hormones like insulin and glucagon, it produces these digestive enzymes too. And when it does that, it's considered an exocrine gland. When it produces the hormones, it's considered an endocrine gland. The female ovaries and testes for males, those are also have exocrine function too. Their exocrine function is the release of gametes. Gametes are the egg and sperm. And so it acts as an exocrine gland for the females, releases the egg out of the ovary into the uterine tubes, into the uterus, and if you want to get pregnant, hopefully implantation, right? So that's its exocrine function. The release of the hormones is its endocrine function, the estrogen and progesterone. For the testes, it releases its gametes or sperm through semen. That's an exocrine function. It exits the body. And then the production of things like testosterone would be the endocrine function. Any questions on the overview of all of our endocrine glands? Okay. Oh, and there's a space for you guys to write that down, huh? I'll give you some time if you need some time to write that down. Once I see people stop writing, then I'll move on.
So the adrenal and the ovary and testes are the only ones that are also exocrine.
The pancreas, ovaries, and testes. Adrenal glands are not.
Oh.
Adrenal glands are just the, endocrine.
Okay.
Pancreas is exocrine. So I'll underline them. Pancreas, ovaries, and testes. Those have exocrine function as well.
Professor.
Yeah.
The pancreas counts as exocrine because we're practically like a donut, right? Because it's just like
Yeah. So anything that goes in our digestive tract is not really inside the body because there is an entry and an exit. So it's only inside the body once we absorb it into the blood. Anything that's in the digestive tract would be considered an internal passageway that's not actually like within the body.
So when we did muscular system, there's excess calcium stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and so all of the organs they have some sort of a sac that stores hormones.
Not necessarily. They are going to produce their hormones when they're triggered by it. So they don't necessarily have storages for. They probably have storages for, or what are they called? Can't remember what they're occlusions. They probably have little vesicles for the materials to make the hormones, but not necessarily just storing the hormones for whenever. That's usually they're triggered to make the hormone. Any other questions? Okay. So a couple notes on epithelial tissue and cancer. So epithelial tissue in general, what are the functions? Secretion is a big one. Absorption too, but what we're talking about here with endocrine system and function, it's going to be secretion is the main function. Another function that's not listed here, you learn in your very first lecture of B32 about these different functions of life, right? You did an activity on one of these functions on an apple, where you cut through an apple and you were looking at the outside environment versus the inside environment. Does anybody remember what function that was? Maintaining boundaries. Yeah, so that is a big function of epithelial tissue. It maintains boundaries. So we find epithelial tissue on the outside and within the inside if it's an organ with a lumen. But we find on the outside and inside of every single organ in the body, right? So one big thing is like our esophagus is lined with epithelial tissue. And we're constantly throwing things down our esophagus. And we have lots of friction. Dead cells kind of go away and then it has to be regenerated. So because of where they're located and kind of their function, epithelial tissue has a very high regeneration rate. We're constantly having to make new epithelial tissue, whether it's your skin or the inside lining of your digestive organs or the outside of the organs where there's friction. We have high regeneration rate. So if we have a high regeneration rate, what process that you learned about in B32 is happening a lot? Mitosis. So lots of mitosis. And so you probably learned the more mitosis that occurs, the more mistakes that can happen, and you're more likely to develop what? Cancer. So this makes cancer more likely than other tissues because of its high regeneration rate. So I don't have a lot of room to write here, so I'm going to go to this kind of blackboard here to write down on. One thing about the iPad and using this blackboard, whatever I write on here, once I go back to the slides, it's gone forever. So when I tell you I'm going to go back to the slides, if I say, does anybody still need it up? If you still need it up, raise your hand, because once I get out of it, you cannot get it back. Okay. So if the cancer of this epithelial tissue, if it's within glandular tissue, so like our endocrine glands that are making these hormones, if it's within glandular tissue, it can either be a non-secreting tumor, and with a non-secreting tumor, cells lose their ability to secrete those hormones. And then we have secreting tumors. Secreting tumors retain their ability to secrete. So let's talk about secreting tumors. If we have a secreting tumor where now we have more cells of that gland because it's a tumor, cancer, it's growing, right? And they retain their ability to secrete. So we have more cells than normal, still producing the hormone that that gland produces. And so with a secreting tumor, do you think we would have a hypersecretion issue or a hyposecretion issue? Hyper. It would be too much. We're producing too much hormone because we have now a tumor, meaning more cells that are still secreting this hormone. So we're probably going to have a hypersecretion issue. And with a non-secreting tumor, yes, you have more cells, but these cells don't secrete anything. And so do you think we're going to have a hyper or hyposecretion problem with a non-secreting tumor? Hyposecretion issue. Right out of room. That's an N at the end. Or hyposecretion. Any questions about that concept of a non-secreting versus a secreting tumor?
Those both happen within the glandular tissue?
We're saying, so if cancer develops within glandular tissue, it's either going to be a secreting tumor or a non-secreting tumor. Yeah. Any other questions? Anybody still need these notes up before they go away forever and ever and ever and ever? Okay. And there they go, they're gone. All right, any questions about epithelial tissue and cancer? Okay, just know that epithelial tissue has a high regeneration rate, meaning more mitosis. Cancer is more likely. And if cancer grows within a gland, it's either going to be a non-secreting or a secreting tumor. All right, so this is just the diagram in your book I want to show you. It shows that same kind of process we talked about with the anterior pituitary. We have the hypothalamus releasing neurohormones into this primary capillary plexus, traveling down to the secondary capillary plexus, and then we have the release of another set of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So if you want to use your textbook, you would refer to this diagram. They did a much better job of showing what the hypothalamus and pituitary gland looks like. I think I did a pretty good job, though. This is how the posterior pituitary works. Okay, we have much longer hypothalamic neurons that are being sent all the way down to the posterior pituitary. There are no epithelial cells here. There's no portal system to manage this. Just the neurohormones get dumped right into the posterior pituitary and are sent out throughout the body. All right, so the next part of our lecture notes are a series of tables of hormones and then also pathways. So one thing I do want to mention, let's see if I have it with me. I should have it with me. Let me get my other one. Part of your homework for this weekend is going to draw out all of the hormone pathways for this lecture. Let me see if I have my example. Okay. So it's going to look something like this. You're going to just draw out all of the flow charts for each hormone. Okay. That's going to be your homework for over the weekend. Now, these are not the only hormones that we're going to talk about this semester. As we go along the semester and bring up different organ systems, you're going to be taught more hormones than what we're going to talk about today. So this is a good reference sheet to have and then to add to throughout the semester as we add more hormones. All right, so for each one of these hormones that we're going to talk about, you want to be able to tell me what the secreting organ is, what the actual hormone in question is, what the target cell or organ of that hormone is, and then what the response is. You should be able to give that information for every hormone that we talk about. And then we'll mention some homeostatic imbalances along the way, diseases and such that are related to those hormones. So the first one we did talk about already, GHRH. The secreting organ here is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is making the GHRH. That GHRH then targets the anterior pituitary, and then once that GHRH binds, it tells the anterior pituitary to then release growth hormone. Very similar with TRH. TRH is released by the hypothalamus. It's going to target the anterior pituitary and get the anterior pituitary to then release thyroid stimulating hormone. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to fill out that table with this information. Anybody still need this table up? Okay. So we're also going to be doing flow charts as well. And you're going to tell me the same information, but in flow chart form. So the first box will be the secreting organ. So you'll put the secreting organ in the first box. You're going to draw an arrow. You're going to write the hormone or the abbreviation for the hormone above the arrow. You'll have a second box. That's the target cell or organ. And then to the side of that box, you're going to tell us what the action or response is. Sometimes we have longer pathways that deal with multiple hormones, but the kind of flow is still the same. Secreting organ, hormone above the arrow to the next secreting organ or the target of the previous one. And then another arrow with the next hormone, and then the final target cell or organ, and then the action or response there. We're going to talk about and fill out these, most of the flow charts together. Once we kind of get the hang of it, then you can do the rest of them on your own. Okay, so the first hormone we're going to talk about, or not first, but the first, or the next one, is growth hormone. So we said that the hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone, or GHRH. that travels down that portal system and binds to receptors in the anterior pituitary. And then those cells in the anterior pituitary will then release growth hormone. So the secreting organ in this case is the anterior pituitary. It has many targets for growth hormone. It targets the liver. We'll talk about what it does there. It targets the bone and cartilage, targets the muscle, targets fat, also targets some other tissues, but you're going to focus on the first four. So when growth hormone targets the liver, it does so to spare glucose. What that means is that it releases glucose to the body. Because what is glucose used to make? ATP. You need lots of ATP in times of growth. Okay, so it targets the liver to release some extra sugar into the bloodstream so that your cells can use it as they grow. It targets bone and cartilage for growth in bone, also growth in cartilage, and growth in muscle. Now, we're not, when we grow muscles, we don't make new muscle cells. We just stuff them with more protein, but that would be the goal of this hormone response. And then fat, it mobilizes fat. What mobilizes fat means is it's going to cause lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat. Fat can also be used as a secondary source of energy. We go to glucose first, sugars are what we use first, but then we use fats next if there's not sugar available. So growth hormone will target fat in order to cause the breakdown of that fat so that we can use that for energy as well in times of growth. So because of the benefits of growth hormone, more energy, more growth in bone, cartilage, muscle, breakdown of fat, people do tend to abuse synthetic growth hormone. So sometimes abused for these effects. A lot of times it'll be people like athletes or actors. But really, with the growing age of social media and things like that, like a lot of people are using growth hormone. It's not good, though. One thing about abusing growth hormone, even though it is seemingly growing more muscle, it does not actually increase your strength or your exercise capacity. It's for looks. Okay, it doesn't actually increase your overall strength. The side effects of that, though, include fluid retention, also joint pain because of the unexpected growth in bone and cartilage. You'll also experience muscle pain for the same reason. Things are growing when they're not meant to grow, when you're actually, as an adult, done growing. And if it's sparing glucose and making sugar more available in the bloodstream, what do you think is also a risk? Diabetes. Okay? That's also a risk for those that abuse growth hormone. And then if we're increasing growth in general, what's another risk? Cancer. Good morning, Shai.
Good morning.
Any questions about those effects?
So if someone has to take growth hormone, like prescribed, are they also like prescribed insulin, or do they just have to watch their sugars?
It would depend on a case-by-case basis how bad the effects are, then if the doctor thinks they need to be put on insulin as well. Yeah.
People who are dwarf, do they ever get cancer?
I mean, in any kind of treatment option, there's always going to be other like pros and cons. You got to weigh the pros and cons. But somebody who maybe has pituitary dwarfism and is on growth hormone replacement therapy, those are risks. Whether you're taking it for looks or you're taking it for an actual medical condition, those risks still exist either way. So some homeostatic imbalances include, as he alluded to, pituitary dwarfism. Those with pituitary dwarfism, and before I do that, can I erase the stuff so I have more stuff to space to write? Okay. So with pituitary dwarfism, I'll go back. Pituitary dwarfism, and for testing purposes, you want to call it pituitary dwarfism. There are like 20 or more different types of dwarfism, so you want to be specific to pituitary dwarfism. But with pituitary dwarfism, these patients or people only grow to about 4 feet tall without intervention. And this is usually caused by a issue with the anterior pituitary, right? It could be a non-secreting tumor that causes less hormone to be released. And so usually they have a decrease in other anterior pituitary hormones as well. So those with pituitary dwarfism, and the other hormones most notably are the thyroid stimulating hormone and FSH and LH. So because we're also not only seeing decreases in growth hormone, but also decreases in thyroid stimulating and FSH and LH, these people often do not reach sexual maturity. So usually they are not able to have children with pituitary dwarfism. It's important to mention the TSH as well as the reproductive hormones, because we talked about permissiveness last time, where you need to have enough thyroid hormone available as a pregnant woman to make sure that your baby's reproductive system develops properly. So without both of these things, these individuals usually don't reach sexual maturity. There's also, so with pituitary dwarfism, this means that there was not enough growth hormone produced during infancy. So they didn't have enough growth hormone to have enough development as they were in their younger years. On the flip side, when you have too much growth hormone produced during childhood, this results in something called gigantism. Okay? With gigantism, these people grow to like 8 feet tall, which is insane and very stressful on the body. So those with gigantism grow to about 8 feet tall on average. They're also going to have enlarged organs compared to others, and lots of joint pain because they're just so large and our joints can only handle so much. Also, we'll talk about when we get to blood vessels. It can be really straining on your heart when you're very tall because your heart has to pump blood out a much longer distance than it normally would. With an average person, same thing has to be returned a much longer distance to get back to the heart. So they usually have issues with like high blood pressure and things like that. Now, gigantism is usually reserved for those that have too much growth hormone during childhood, so before their growth plates have closed. If they continue to have growth hormone being released too much after their growth plates have closed, it's a different condition called acromegaly. So if the growth plates have closed, the condition is referred to as acromegaly. And so with this one, and this is usually caused by a secreting tumor of the anterior pituitary. So they have a secreting tumor in their anterior pituitary that's continuing to release growth hormone, even though they're adults. Even though their growth plates have long been closed, they're still producing too much of this growth hormone, and that leads to acromegaly. Usually with these people, and I'll show you a picture in a little bit, they usually have overgrown face as well as hands and feet. They will also experience joint pain, like the gigantism, and then usually have a deepened voice as well. That's really small. You probably can't see that, but overgrown face and hands and hands and feet, joint pain, and a deeper voice is what they'll experience.
Would they also be really tall too, or
It all depends on when that growth hormone release started. So if it was after growth plates have closed, they're not going to grow any taller. Okay. But if it
Someone
was
can
through,
have both, like gigantism and the acro.
well, if it started in childhood, it would remain gigantism.
Oh,
It's if it
okay.
develops in adulthood is when it's acromegaly.
So if it develops in adulthood, it's because it's from, so this is pretty.
Tumor and interpituitary usually.
And the antihistamine is because.
It could be. It could also be a tumor, but also could be just a malformation of their antipituitary, just not producing enough of that hormone.
So if they have like if it happened in childhood, does it usually go on into adulthood as well?
It can if they're not being treated for it.
Okay.
But I would think by then they may not last. They may not live that long. Yeah.
So gigantism turns into like acromegaly?
No, it depends on when it originated. So if it started in childhood, it's gigantism. If it started in adulthood, it's acromegaly. They don't like switch to one or the other because they'll have different effects.
What would be adulthood, like 15 years old?
After growth plates have closed. So that's going to be for males, like, when is it? Like anywhere from 15 to 18, something like that. I have to go back and look at my B32 notes. But yeah, it all depends. It's different from person to person. But once growth plates have closed, if it develops after that, then it's considered acromegaly.
Is it the same number for females?
No, it's different. Usually females' growth plates close before males do. Anybody else? Okay. All right, so this is an image. So the female in the picture is of average height and condition. The taller person, somebody with gigantism, and then the smaller person with pituitary dwarfism. Acromegaly is going to have, again, a very enlarged face, very enlarged hands and feet, usually a very prominent forehead and kind of eyebrow arches. Very large features for those people. All right, so the pathway for this, the hypothalamus is going to release the neurohormone, which is GHRH. It is going to bind to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary will then release growth hormone. And then growth hormone is going to target these tissues with these responses. Now, if you have the table filled out, you can use that table to fill in the flow charts later. We're already at 9:10, so I don't want to take too much time with just writing those down if you have it already in the tables. And you can also come up here during lab and take pictures of these tables and charts if you need to. This is just the diagram of this pathway from your textbook. And again, hypothalamus releases GHRH at the very top. Then it releases, it's going to cause the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. And then that's going to target liver, bone, and other tissues for those responses that we discussed. All right, so for thyroid hormone, it's a much more involved, longer process here. So thyroid releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus. It targets the anterior pituitary to get it to release thyroid stimulating hormone. And then thyroid stimulating hormone, which just came from the anterior pituitary, then targets the thyroid gland to then release thyroid hormone. So thyroid gland epithelial cells make thyroid hormones, which can be, it's T3 and T4. T4 is specifically thyroxine. Any one of those terms can be fine for identifying this particular hormone. So you can call it thyroid hormone, you can call it thyroxine, you can call it T3 and T4, whichever ones that you're more comfortable with. And you do not need to know the difference between T3 and T4 in function, just one has 3 iodines, the other one has 4 iodines. We'll talk about Graves' disease here in a second. Once thyroid hormone is released by the thyroid gland, and then it's going to target most body cells. Remember, all of our body cells have the ability to metabolize, so it really can target any cell in order to increase metabolism. Any questions on that? Okay. And most of that table was already filled out for you, I think. All right, so this is a negative feedback loop for thyroid hormone and all the related ones. So again, hypothalamus releases TRH. That binds to cells of the anterior pituitary to then release TSH. That binds to cells of the thyroid gland to then release thyroid hormone. And so we do have a negative feedback loop here. If we have enough thyroid hormone or we're getting close to the higher end of that range for thyroid hormone, there's going to be a negative feedback loop telling both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to slow down production. So that should slow down TRH production, it should slow down TSH production, and then it should slow down thyroid hormone production so that we get it back into our normal range. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. And remember, the action is to increase cell metabolism. So one condition I want to talk to you about is Graves' disease. With Graves' disease, this happens during an infection, or it can be triggered by an infection. And so what happens with Graves' disease is that the immune system, after getting an infection, the immune system makes TSH-like antibodies. When you get infected, your adaptive immune system is responsible for making antibodies so that in case you ever come in contact with it again, it can be broken down and gotten rid of. And so the Graves' disease is caused by a reaction of you getting an infection, and that causes your immune system to make this antibody that's shaped like TSH. So what ends up happening, I'm going to do a little drawing here. So let's say this is a thyroid gland cell. This is its receptor for TSH. This is our normal TSH that will fit in that receptor, and when it binds, it's going to cause the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Okay? In the case of Graves' disease, where you have your immune system that's making this TSH-like antibody, you're going to have a mimic and I'll draw another receptor. But that mimic can also fit. I'm not really good at drawing hearts. But that mimic can also fit in that TSH receptor. Okay. So what ends up happening with somebody with Graves' disease is we have this negative feedback loop, right? If there's too much thyroid hormone, we have a negative feedback loop to tell the hypothalamus to slow down production of TRH. We tell the anterior pituitary to slow down production of TSH, and that should bring our thyroid hormone levels back down. However, if you have this TSH mimic floating around that looks like TSH, acts like TSH, it can actually continue to bind to those thyroid gland cells and have it continuously produce thyroid hormone even when we don't want it to, right? So we have mechanisms to keep thyroid hormone down, but if we have this little imposter that's coming and stimulating the thyroid gland all the time, it's still going to produce that thyroid hormone, and our levels are going to be way too high. Okay. Does that make sense to everyone? So With people with Graves' disease that have this continuous binding of the thyroid gland cells to produce the thyroid hormone, even when the body doesn't call for it, will have lots of signs and symptoms of that because you're increasing cell metabolism when your body doesn't need it. And so the signs and symptoms of that, and I'm going to put it on my board here so I have more room. So the signs and symptoms of that include increased metabolism, of course. So that could include sudden weight loss because of the increase in metabolism. Because of when we're talking about increased metabolism, that is in all cells throughout the body, including your heart. So if we increase the metabolism of the heart, you're going to have increased heart rate and possibly irregular beats. Because of the high metabolism, this person may have increased sweating, increased nervousness, and for some reason, it affects the connective tissue behind the eyes, which is called exophthalmos. So EXOPHTHALMOS, exophthalmos. And just so you know, there is a difference between a symptom and a sign, and you should know that. A symptom is something that is patient provided. So if a patient comes in and says, I have a headache, that's not something you can necessarily measure. I'm feeling fatigued, or I'm feeling nervous or anxious or what have you. Those are things that only the patient can provide versus a sign. A sign is something that's measurable and can be verified by a doctor or clinician or what have you, a medical professional. Everyone okay with that difference? Okay. Any questions about Graves' disease?
So basically,
No, go.
basically during an infection, the mimic antibody of TSH will mimics TSH, creates the antibody of TSH, but it's not actually TSH. So when it's able to bind to the receptor, it doesn't do what TSH does, and then it causes
Oversecretion or overproduction. Yeah.
oversecretion or overproduction of thyroid hormone.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So this TSH mimic is going to act just like TSH does. Okay, we can control the amount of TSH through our negative feedback. If we have too much thyroid hormone, we tell the antipituitary, slow it down, do not produce so much TSH, we don't need it. Okay, that's our way of controlling TSH. We cannot control this TSH mimic that's coming from the immune system. You had an infection, it triggered the production of this antibody, and now it's circulating. And so that's going to act just like that TSH because it's shaped just like it. It fits into that receptor. And so it can trigger the thyroid gland to keep overproducing that thyroid hormone even when we don't want it to. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions? Did you have a question?
The extra.
Exophthalmos?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I think that's the bug eyes, right?
Oh, yes. I'm going to show you a picture of it right now. Anybody still need this app? Okay. That's the exophthalmos. So for some reason that's less understood, this Graves' disease affects the connective tissue behind the eye, and it causes the bulging eyes.
Professor,
Yeah.
would the explanation that you just gave of how Graves' disease affects some of our cells receptors, is that similar to how like artificial sugar would affect like insulin and like cells in our body?
Oh yeah, yeah. It'd be like I don't know if it's exactly 1-to-1, but yeah, there's mimics for a lot of different chemicals. As long as it has the correct shape to bind in the same way that the natural chemical is, you're gonna have kind of the same effect or phenomenon happen. Yeah.
If people have hyperthyroidism, would they also get that, the bulging of the eyes, or no?
It's usually not considered associated with, yeah, just with Graves. Yeah. And so in this case with Graves' disease, you may see really low TSH levels because of this negative feedback loop, but thyroid hormone levels are still really high. Okay? You don't have the normal trigger, but you have this mimic trigger that's still causing a release of thyroid hormone, even though TSH levels are very low. All right, everyone okay with the concept of Graves' disease? Okay. So this would be the pathway. Hypothalamus releases TRH, which targets the anterior pituitary gland to then release TSH, which targets the thyroid gland to then release thyroid hormone, and that's going to target most body cells. All right, we still have lots of hormones to talk about, and it's already 9:25, so I'm going to have you guys take a 10-minute break right now. I'm going to try to get through as much of the hormones as I can, but that's actually going to help you for the lab portion today. And I promise just endocrine is extremely long. Most other lectures will keep it under that 9:25 cutoff. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording. You can take 10 minutes and just be back here at 9:35.